On April 10, 1815, the Tambora volcano in Sumbawa exploded with such force that it changed the world. The fallout from this eruption ruined crops, caused disease, killed thousands, and changed the seasons around the globe. It hit the United States the following year, causing failed harvests across the East Coast. Among those impacted were farmers Joseph and Lucy Mack Smith. With fields full of dead crops, the Smith family was left with no choice but to relocate from Vermont to a place they had heard was ripe with opportunity, Palmyra, New York. Tambora's effects reached far beyond farmlands. Many around the world feared that these severe conditions were a sign of God's wrath, leading to a frantic search for religion and salvation. It was in the midst of this spiritual confusion that Joseph Smith Jr., the teenage son of Joseph and Lucy, would discover this eternal truth, that God answers the prayers of all who lack wisdom and seek after Him. I invite you to join us in our study of Joseph Smith History 1, verses 1 through 26. Welcome to Come Follow Up.
This time reading through Joseph Smith history, the thing that stood out to me most was that he says when he knelt down in the grove, he poured out the desires of his heart to God.
Something I've learned from Joseph Smith about seeking revelation is that the Lord loves effort.
I found Joseph Smith was a prophet by just doing the same thing that he did, by praying and asking if he was the prophet.
I think Joseph Smith has been an example to me, showing that I can trust in God.
One thing that Joseph Smith did is he was pondering beforehand, before the prayer, and he listened during, before, after. He got more revelation after. And so one thing I do is after a prayer, I'll just leave the call open. Go about my day, but keep listening for that answer if I haven't gotten it yet.
Welcome, everybody, to our discussion on Joseph Smith History 1, verses 1 through 26. My name is Ben Lomu, and I'm your host. Seated next to me is our gospel scholar, Jenet Erickson. Jenet is a professor in the Department of Church History and Doctrine at Brigham Young University. She has a PhD in Family Social Science from the University of Minnesota. She is a research fellow at the Wheatley Institute and has been a columnist on family issues for the Deseret News since 2013. Welcome, Jenet.
So good to be here, Ben. Thank you.
And seated next to Jenet is our special guest, Jeremiah Joseph Morgan. Jeremiah is the Deputy Attorney General for the state of Missouri and has served as an Area 70 in the Missouri Independence Area Coordinating Council. Jeremiah was raised in the Community of Christ faith and joined the church when he was 18. He and his wife, Rebecca, are the parents of 5 children. Welcome, Jeremiah.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Ben.
And we're also joined by our studio audience. Thank you all for being here with us today. Okay, Jenet, as we jump into this part of the Joseph Smith history, what sort of background and context can you provide for us?
We're going to be reading sections of scripture that actually are the history that Joseph, with Sidney Rigdon, wrote to help establish the truth of the origins of the church. It came at a time in 1838 when there was tremendous persecution. They'd already been pushed out of independence. Yeah. Joseph is living in Far West, and together they feel that they should establish the truth of the history of the church, and it begins with this remarkable vision. This is not the only time he will dictate or write about this story. There are 4 accounts. This one has the particular purpose of being very detailed to lay down once and for all, in a sense, the truth of this story.
Thank you, Jenet. Our discussions today will be focused on Joseph Smith History 1 through 26, and structured around the following study ideas from Come Follow Me. Joseph Smith is the prophet of the restoration. How can I receive answers to my prayers? Joseph Smith saw God the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. I can remain true to what I know, even if others reject me. So, Jenet, the first topic we're going to be looking at specifically is Joseph Smith is the prophet of the restoration. Now, as far as that topic goes, where do we see that within the beginnings of this Joseph Smith history record?
Yeah, this remarkable story. Here's an obscure boy, and Joseph is wondering, what do I need to do to receive salvation for my soul? How can I be reconciled to God? And it's in answer to that yearning that Joseph is given a manifestation of God himself to answer that question. In verse 16 of Joseph Smith history, we read, "I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. It no sooner appeared than I found myself delivered from the enemy which held me bound. When the light rested upon me, I saw two personages whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, 'This is my beloved Son. Hear him.'"
Jenet, Joseph Smith was prophesied that he would be the prophet of the restoration. Can we read some of those verses?
Yeah, would love to. It must have been amazing for the prophet Joseph as he is translating the Book of Mormon to come across these verses. We'll go to 2 Nephi chapter 3, where Lehi is prophesying to his children. This is verse 7. He's quoting the great prophet Joseph, who was sold into Egypt. "Yea, Joseph truly said, Thus saith the Lord unto me, a choice seer will I raise up out of the fruit of thy loins, and he shall be esteemed highly among the fruit of thy loins. And unto him will I give commandment that he shall do a work for the fruit of thy loins, his brethren, which shall be of great worth unto them, even to the bringing of them to the knowledge of the covenants which I have made with thy fathers. And I will give unto him a commandment that he shall do none other work, save the work which I shall command him, and I will make him great in mine eyes, for he shall do my work." And then he testifies, this will be a prophet like unto Moses. He'll be named after his father, Joseph. He'll have my name, the prophet Joseph was testifying, and be named after his father. So all of these things were put in place for this fulfillment of this prophecy that had gone on since the beginning of time, really.
Jeremiah, as we've been talking about things that were put in place for Joseph to receive this specific calling, when you think about your own life, what are some of the things that God put in place that prepared you to serve in various capacities?
You know, I was raised by a single mother who taught me the gospel. The restoration of the gospel was important to her, so important. She gave my middle name after Joseph Smith and read to me from the Book of Mormon. All of those things culminated when I was a young teenager, about 14 actually, when because of the confusion and the difficulty I was having understanding which of these is really the true restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In that process, I had the opportunity to investigate really both churches. I went to the church of my childhood and then the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for 2 months straight. Didn't tell anyone. And including my mother. And when I came to the knowledge of the truthfulness of this, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I could feel that. And that preparation, all that my mother had done, all that even my name, had prepared me for that opportunity. Now, I told my mother first about my decision. She was not happy about it. But like Joseph, I knew that I had a testimony, and I knew God did too. And that made the difference for me.
How much of that testimony was based off of your knowledge that Joseph Smith was the prophet of the restoration?
Yeah, I would say the great majority of it was. That in the Book of Mormon, those two things, I knew those things were true. And so when I was looking, I wasn't looking everywhere. I knew that Joseph was a prophet of God, and I knew that the Book of Mormon was true. And so I had sort of narrowed down my field of, where I should search, where I should investigate. And so those played a critical role and what he taught. Now, when I did that investigation, I thought of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the plan of salvation, as this great puzzle. And pieces of those were missing in my life. And when I found out what I was missing from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it was completion of that puzzle. And that made all the difference for me too.
So Jen, in our preparations for this discussion, we had a question that came up and I would love to get your thoughts on. Why are there multiple accounts of the first vision?
Yeah, such a wonderful question. And then when we think about it, we're like, of course there's multiple accounts. There are 4 accounts of him either dictating or writing his story of this event. And we should know right off, first of all, this family that he's growing up in are not a literary people. They knew how to read, and they wrote carefully records about their farm, how much was being spent here and all of that. But it was not a time when people wrote about their religious experiences or recorded journal types of things.
Yeah, they wrote about the day-to-day things that they needed for their to survive,
yes.
right? Yes.
And then other things were passed on orally. And I think there's something powerful about that because Joseph is not going to be learning from the great books. He will be learning from God himself. When he finally does record, it's 1832, the first time he writes about this, he's recognizing that God has asked him to write history. And in his own hand, he writes about the deep question of his soul, which was, does God forgive me of my sins? Am I okay with God? And that's the way he writes that first account. The account in 1835 is different. He's going to write different details in it because the person in front of him that he's talking to, who was a religious charismatic that says, I got to go meet this other man named Joseph that is a prophet. And so he's going to give different details than when he's writing about it personally for his own, what was on his mind at the time. And he's writing for different purposes or dictating for different purposes. And that's bringing out different details. So there will be another one. We have this one in 1838 that will be for the purpose of writing very carefully what happened for the whole world to know this was real. And it's going to come with a little bit of a defensive tone. This is what happened. And so we hear that language again and again. Yeah. I saw what I saw. And then the last one that he's going to record is when a man says, doing a history of New Hampshire, you come from New Hampshire, because Joseph had been there as a boy. Will you tell us about the history of the church? And so that one is also a little bit different because he's not trying to defend something. It's someone asking politely, will you just tell us your story? And each one, because it's for a different audience, triggered by a different experience, is going to draw out different details. That's how we are as human beings.
I can personally relate to this because I joined the church when I turned 18. I didn't grow up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I grew up in the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now the Community of Christ. And my experience of going through that and the work that I did to gain a testimony of the church, I've told that story in my experience probably over the last 30 years, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of times. And each time is slightly different just because the audience is different, the circumstances are different, or I remember something that comes to my mind and says, you should share this part of it. And so, that experience that Joseph had telling the experience of the first vision to different audiences is really a human experience.
Mm-hmm. In so many ways, it confirms the veracity of it because if it were a canned story, it would be the same, right? He would be careful to say exactly the same details, but it's real and true. And so it's going to come out in a real and true way, which is with different details highlighted based on the audience, what's triggering in his mind based on the context of it.
I would love to hear from the audience. What has helped you strengthen your testimony of the prophet Joseph Smith? Kyle.
One thing that has helped me strengthen my testimony is just a continual seeking and reading in the Book of Mormon. Because for me, each time I invest time in reading the Book of Mormon, I just feel that warmth and that joy and that power that comes from God. It fills my soul with confidence and a peace and a love. And it just strengthens my testimony that the prophet Joseph Smith is and was called of God and that he was a true prophet.
Kyle, thanks so much for sharing that with us. Great comment. Jenet, the first vision that we're studying this week, it was just the first piece of a great restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what are some of the other pieces of the restoration that Joseph Smith fulfilled that we can look at?
Yeah. It's powerful, Ben, that the restoration begins with this experience, of course, remarkable to have seen the Father and the Son. And they initiate this pouring out of revelation. And it begins with Joseph first coming to the truth that it wasn't going to be through some intermediary, even the Bible, but that he could ask God directly and God will answer. So as he receives instruction about finding the plates, he begins that process of translation. he's reading through and translating, then he has other questions about baptism, about the gift of the Holy Ghost. That leads him in prayer to seeking, and it's time to pour out priesthood power understanding. Then time to pour out truth about the church and its structure and order. Then it's time to pour out truth about priesthood ordinances in the temple, which means keys have to be restored from Elijah and Elias that allow for the fullness of priesthood power on the earth to initiate the full gathering into temples whereby the entire family of God can be sealed together, eternally bound together. So it's this beautiful layer upon layer of the restoration that Joseph is being prepared for initially with that pattern of asking, receiving, asking, receiving.
Well, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences as we've discussed our first topic. Joseph Smith is the prophet of the restoration. And for the audience, thank you as well for sharing. And for you at home, how has your life been blessed because of the prophet Joseph Smith? Join the conversation on Facebook or Instagram.
I go by prayer by first getting to a headspace where I'm able to receive revelation and able to talk to him. And then I like to be on my knees as well, so that I'm able to feel a little more humble.
I'm praying all the time. I pray in my heart and my mind.
I think prayer is something that I don't take advantage of enough because it is direct communication with our Father in heaven. And that's what I try and remember as I pray, that I am speaking directly with my Father.
Going back to the study ideas from Come Follow Me, let's now talk about how can I receive answers to my prayers. Jenet, what sort of context do we need to understand as we get into this next topic?
Yeah. This is the story of the first vision, right? That we can receive answers to our prayers. Joseph, as a boy, he's hearing all of this talk. And I think we typically think of him going with the question, what church should I join? But there's a deeper question that Joseph had before that church question. And it was about the status of his soul. Where do I stand in regard to God? And he desperately wanted to know he could be redeemed. And so that's what led to that question. What church then will lead me to salvation? And it's a Methodist minister that highlights James 1 and 5. And so he's led to James 1 and 5 with that powerful answer where he's told, and we're going to see this in verse 11, I was one day reading the epistle of James, first chapter and 5th verse, which reads, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God directly, and God will not withhold. He has that answer given to him. God himself appears with his son. And then we see in verse 18, my object in going to inquire of the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right. In verse 19, I was answered, and it was an answer he didn't expect, that I should join none of them. Then we hear in verse 25, as he bears witness that he had received an answer, so it was with me. I had actually seen a light. I have actually seen a vision. And who am I that I can withstand God? I had found the testimony of James to be true, that a man who lacked wisdom might ask of God and obtain. It's such a beautiful witness, and he walks us through, this is reality, this is what happened to me.
Jeremiah, when have you been this sure that you had received an answer to one of your prayers?
Yeah. I go back to when I was looking into researching, investigating the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That was my question too. Which church is true? Is this really the Church of Jesus Christ? You know, part of what I had to do was go through and investigate, look and search and find. And there's challenges that come with that. It never comes easy, right? And that was true for me too. But when I got an answer, I knew it was true. And I could feel that the Holy Ghost testify that the church was true. When I knew that was true, everything else that would happen thereafter really didn't matter. And I will say, after I told my mother, she called all of my relatives and pastors and so forth. I talked to all kinds of people. But because of the witness of the Holy Ghost, I knew that this was true. So I was certain like that. If we can get that kind of testimony, then when the challenges come, which they will, undoubtedly, and they have for me too, even afterwards, then we can stand up to that. We know the witness that God has given to us.
Jenet, what sort of pattern do we see of revelation through Joseph Smith's experience?
Yeah, so beautiful. It's laid out for us. If we just go to verse 8 of Joseph Smith's History 1, we're going to see this pattern of preparation, study, and then pondering, reflecting on it. So if we start in verse 8, he says, during this time of great excitement, my mind was called up to serious reflection. Then it says, I attended. There's several meetings. I went to seek. I accessed what I could to find the truth that was available. And then in verse 11, while I was laboring under the difficulties caused by this contest, I was one day reading. And then in verse 12, I reflected on it again and again. And then, of course, at length, I came to the conclusion that I must either remain in darkness or I must ask of God. I came to the determination to ask of God. Verse 14, so with this determination, I went to the woods. His first time, he says, to pray aloud. He prepared, he studied, he pondered, and an answer was given.
So Jeremiah, how have you been able to use a similar pattern to rediscover personal revelation, or even as you're seeking an answer, whether it's related to something within the church or something within your personal life or professional life?
Yeah. I reflect upon an experience that I had working as an attorney, and I had a very difficult case. And on the other side of that case, I had attorneys that were working, I don't want to say against me, but working in the case. They're preparing their case, and it was difficult. It was challenging, so much so that I felt that kind of anxiety, not in the spiritual sense, but the anxiety with respect to my work. It was one night, I was up late. I had some work to do the very next morning, very early, and I just was filled with anxiety about this situation. It was about midnight, and I still could not get to sleep. And so I decided I would just get out of bed and I would work. But before that happened, an impression came to me, I should pray. And I should pray, not just help me, but help my opponent, help my opposing counsel, which is a surprising thing to think of. It's a surprising thing to think about, an answer to that. And that's what I did. I got out on my knees and I prayed, please bless my opposing counsel, the other attorney, who was making it very difficult for me. And it was after all that challenge that I got up from that prayer. There was nothing in my circumstances that changed, but really everything had changed. Right? My heart had changed. I had seen things differently. And so I felt that answer to my prayer in a professional setting, which we can all have. It's not just in our testimonies, in our spiritual lives, but also in our personal lives.
Jen, one of the takeaways that we get from Joseph's account is that God answers prayers in a variety of ways. What are some of the ways that we can learn from this account and others in the scriptures?
Yeah. One of my favorites, Ben, is the story of Elijah. So here's 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 12. And we're going to hear just before this answer that the mountains are being broken in pieces. There's rocks, there's wind, there's earthquake. And it ends in verse 11 saying, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. We love this story of Joseph Smith. It tells us God is active, that he appears to his children as needed to reveal himself. But often the answer for us will be in a still, small voice, deeply personal to our own hearts. So there's one more story we have to turn to that I love. It's in Doctrine and Covenants section 6. And this is Oliver Cowdery, who's been trying to know what you were trying to figure out, right. Jeremiah. Is this the truth? And is the Lord in this work? And how can I be part of this work? And the Lord is going to answer him. We love the answer he receives in section 8, that the Lord will teach us in our mind and our heart. But one of my favorite things is in section 6, verse 23. This is how personal this God is. He'll say to Oliver, who's wondering about all these things, did I not speak peace to your mind concerning the matter? What greater witness can you have than from God? And so he's going to tell us, I will speak peace to your soul. And to be so personal with Oliver, he says in the verse before that, just remember the night when you prayed to me, and here he says the answer, that you cried unto me in your heart, that you might know concerning the truth of these things. Remember, Oliver, you were alone, and no one would know that Oliver had prayed except God himself. And Oliver knew that. The Lord answers us so personally in the way that we can hear not in a worldly way, but to our very soul, to our heart. I love that.
I will say sometimes some of those answers that we receive, we may not even recognize when we get the answer. That's happened to me many times where I've prayed for something and hoped that it would come about and then didn't even recognize it until later in my life and saw, wow, God was in that.
And sometimes, as you see with Joseph, he received the answer that he wasn't even asking for. He said, which church should I join? He was expecting, okay, you're going to go to this particular faith. And the answer was, don't join any of them. And I love how we just learned so much about this pattern of prayer and revelation from Joseph's experience. I would love to hear from the audience on how has the Lord answered your prayers in an unexpected way? Alexa.
I was a really serious child growing up. And so before I was baptized, I really wanted to know that the church was true. And I studied it, and I was out on my bike thinking through, well, what do I know? What seems to be the truth? And when I came in and into my room and actually sat down and prayed, I just was suddenly filled with the love of God. And it was just so unexpected. It was very clearly not me. It was very much the Spirit, just soft but strong sense of peace and assurance.
That's beautiful. Alexa, thank you so much. Jenet, in our preparation for this discussion, we had a question that came up, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it. What truths about the nature of God in Jesus Christ were revealed when they appeared to Joseph?
It was pretty significant. In fact, when Joseph, who was kind of close, it seems, to a Methodist preacher, and Joseph's been seeking to have the experiences these preachers tell people they can have, where they can actually feel and experience something powerful from God, and Joseph has. So he goes to tell this preacher, thinking he'll be excited for him, and he finds out this man is not at all and rejects it. I think what happens is the theology Joseph teaches is so radical that God and the Son, that they are distinct beings, that the Father's work is to tell us to listen to the Son, that they are embodied, that we are in their image, is just more than this preacher can handle. And so he's going to be rejecting of this radical theology. But I think what's most powerful, and sometimes we can obscure this because we're excited about, look at what they learned, what Joseph learned, right? But most of all, he learned that God cares about his children, that he knows us by name, that he yearns to pour out answers, that he is real and a father, that God is a compassionate being, and he yearns to pour out answers, and that he will, that he's actively involved in our lives. So he walks out of the grove, and the description that he has in 1832 is, my soul was filled with love. He'd felt the love of God, and it was so overpowering that for some time, that feeling did not go away from him.
And from this point, you can see Joseph moves forward. And, there's some, as he explains, there's a few ups and downs along the way. But he has so much confidence in this prayer that was answered. Jeremiah, can you speak to us about how has receiving an answer to a prayer given you confidence to move forward in your life?
Yeah. So I've had many of those experiences in my life where I've faced a challenging situation or circumstance. And because of experiences that I've had in the past, receiving answers, I knew I could go back to God and ask again. Now, many times I was hoping that God would answer more quickly, or maybe even the way that I wanted, honestly. But as I reflect upon it, as I look back upon it, it has always been exactly what I needed. One of those experiences was I was deciding on a job change. And I had experiences asking God and receiving answers, and I did it again. But this time, the struggle happened, and it carried on for a few months. And I'm thinking to myself, when will this end? When will I get to the end of this? Is there an end to it? But it did come. And so because of that, because of the experience I had, I knew that God would deliver on his promise that he gives to all of us, that he will answer our prayers.
Thank you both so much. What a wonderful conversation. I'm excited to continue speaking in Footnotes. This has been such a great conversation on receiving answers to our prayers. And for the audience, you've been wonderful. Thanks for joining us today and for sharing your experiences also. And for you at home, we still have much to cover in Footnotes. Stay with us.
I feel the Spirit in many different ways, but the way that I mostly feel the Spirit is trust and confidence that God has for me and that I have in Him.
I feel the Spirit mostly by clarity. By sound of mind, I feel like if I can feel good about what I'm thinking, and I can have a clear path to what I want to do, and I often feel like that's the Spirit.
The Spirit usually isn't loud. It usually doesn't push answers at us. It waits for me to receive them.
The way that I feel the Spirit is through a consistent thought or a feeling. It's not usually a thought that I would think of or a feeling that I would know it's from me. It's something I know it's from God because it's consistent and that it's a push or a confidence to do it.
Welcome to Come Follow Up Footnotes. We've dismissed our studio audience and now turn to our deeper dive into Joseph Smith History 1, verses 1 through 26 with Jenet and Jeremiah. I'm really excited to jump back in. Thanks so much for what you've shared already in our previous discussions. Jenet, I'd love to jump back into talking about the four accounts that Joseph shares, maybe discuss some of the differences and similarities and why he shared certain things.
Yeah, so wonderful to have this history so available. So all of us can find all the accounts really easily. So if we just go to the Gospel Library and we go to church history, then we can find where all of these church history accounts contain Joseph's records. So I think all of us that have studied these love the first one, love all of them, but you're not as familiar with his own. And it's a remarkable story because Joseph has been in Kirtland, he's gone to Missouri with all the difficulty, and he's coming back from Missouri with Newell K. Whitney and Sidney Rigdon, and they run into a great difficulty with a carriage that ends up runaway horses. They have to jump off. Joseph and Sidney both get off safely, this fast-moving carriage, but Newell K. Whitney trips, breaks his leg in multiple places, and they have to stay in Indiana before going to Ohio. And Joseph's there. He decides he's got to stay with this man and not leave him. And while he's with him, there's a grove of trees behind where they stay that he goes to meditate in. And it's almost like just being in that place brings back poignantly his memories as a 14-year-old boy in a grove of trees. And so we think he starts writing this record, his first written account of his experience, the first vision. And it's so beautiful. I mean, just listen to some of this language. I felt to mourn for my own sins and for the sins of the world. For I looked upon the sun and the earth and the moon and also the stars, and he's wondering, where is God? There is no God. Where is God, right? They all bespeak God, these people that I'm hearing, but where is he? Therefore, I cried unto the Lord for mercy, for there was none else to whom I could go and obtain mercy. So he doesn't focus on two personages. He doesn't focus on the darkness. His intent in writing this, what's poignant in his mind right then, is I needed forgiveness and I needed mercy from God, and I received it. And so he'll end by describing so beautifully, my soul was filled with love, and for many days I could rejoice with great joy. The Lord was with me, but I could find none that would believe the heavenly vision. The 1835 and 1838, 1842, those are the other three accounts that Joseph either writes or dictates. So he writes this first one, and you can actually see his handwriting. Yeah. It's interesting as he's writing it, he comes to the point where he describes a pillar of light. And first when he writes fire. And then you see him cross it out and then put light. And he's trying, as he would say, the pen is like a broken instrument to try to capture who God is in mortal language.
And we see that in other scriptures too, where they describe, words cannot describe.
Yes.
We see that, with Jesus Christ visiting the people in America.
Yeah. Yes.
We see it in other places where, our ability to express what we experienced, and that's the case with Joseph, words just really can't capture.
I love just to this point of that this is a boy. This whole record just speaks to this is a 14-year-old boy, his honesty. I love how when he returns from the vision to his home, it records that he tells his mother, he doesn't say, guess what just happened to me? And you can imagine, no 14-year-old boy is going to be coming home and just, can I just describe this deeply
Oh, I've had
personal
lots
experience?
of conversations with 14-year-old boys, and they're usually something like, how was your day? Fine.
Fine.
That's exactly
Something
right.
like
And
that.
that's just
And we're
Joseph.
seeing that in Joseph, right?
Oh, I love how he says,
I'm well enough.
never,
Yes.
all is well. I'm fine. I'm fine, Mom.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, what's a boy going to say? It's just what you said.
I'm well enough
right?
off.
I'm well enough.
Right.
After he's not going to open up about it. And then he just says, I've learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true. This is the middle of verse 20.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about just the power of that phrase, I have learned for myself? And Jeremiah, I don't know if you can share some experiences where you have really learned for yourself to the point where you're able to stand on your own 2 feet, regardless of everything that's happening around you, and move forward with confidence in your testimony.
Yeah, I think that's really the story of the restoration and the continual restoration, where the expectation or the desire for all of us is to be able to stand on our own, learn for ourselves, not depend or rely upon somebody else, which is okay to do it for a beginning. I don't want to overstate it in the sense of we should and can rely upon the testimony of others. In fact, one of the gifts of the Spirit is to believe on the testimony of somebody else, and there's nothing wrong with that. But going beyond that, to be able to stand on our own. So in my own personal experience, coming to a witness of Jesus Christ, a testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and as you said, Ben, when we hope that everyone comes to that, and I think as parents and teachers and leaders, that we want to make sure that people put in the work and the effort so that they can, when the times are difficult, they can stand on their own.
It seems like the prophet President Nelson, I mean, when he comes as our newly called prophet, that's his message.
That is his message.
Hear him. And he goes through all the scripture accounts. What does the Father always say when he introduces the Son? Hear him, and you can hear him.
Yeah.
Go back to when you were first, I think you said you were about 14 years old.
Yeah, I was.
So,
Exactly this age. Yeah.
what were those beginning stages like? Was there a moment where you felt like you were hearing him say, look, there's something more that I want for you and for your life?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I've reflected upon this over and over again. As I've told my story about how I came to know, I thought about what was it that caused me to have an interest or have that desire. I mean, how many 14-year-olds,
Are thinking about
are
these things.
thinking about that
Openly, yeah.
And so for me, it was, I would say, it's a combination of many things. One, of course, the upbringing of my mother, who was this devout spiritual giant for me. And so I had that deep inside my bones, if you will. And so you take that, and then you have added on to that something very similar to what Joseph experienced, the confusion, uncertainty that I was experiencing in my own faith, in my own religion at the time. And so you combine that and all those things together. And I would say also, now this is a little bit further down the road, but my great-great-great-grandparents had joined the original church, were baptized by Oliver Cowdery, and were with the saints in Independence and Far West and then Nauvoo. And actually in 1846, they received their endowment and their temple ordinances in the Nauvoo Temple.
Wow.
Right? Then subsequently had left. Now, I will say this, and I think I'm on safe ground with what President Nelson has taught about covenants, the power of covenants. Those, if we will live our covenants, they have generational impact, generational connection. And so that's one piece that I didn't realize for a long time that had an impact upon me. The covenants that had been made long, long ago in the temple had an impact on me. So you combine all those things together, and then you have this desire to know, am I in the right place? What am I missing? And so as a 14-year-old, it's surprising that any 14-year-old would have that. Joseph had it, obviously, but to have that desire to find out more, to learn and to grow. And the beautiful thing about Joseph is that wasn't just when he was 14 or 16 or 18 or 20. It continued all throughout his life.
And he wanted all of us to have the same ability.
Have that same experience. Yeah. What a gift he had, because, of course, the the persecution, the difficulties he experienced just after this from the minister that he related to it was just the beginning of those experiences that he would have. You know, I think of it, so my mind draws to the Liberty Jail. I live just a few miles from the Liberty Jail. And there, of course, he's in jail for months on end. Difficulty and challenging circumstances. I would be surprised if they didn't pray for deliverance many times before that.
Yeah.
And yet 4 months had passed, and then you hear it's almost an echo of what is happening here in the first vision, with the darkness and the difficulties, and that he's on the brink, right? Sort of feels like desperation, and where he says, "Oh God, where art thou? Where's the pavilion that hideth thy covering place?" And then you see this beautiful message, much like the first vision, where he says, "My son, peace be unto thy soul." You see kind of the echoes of that same experience,
powerful.
and he experiences it over and over again. It wouldn't be the end of it. He would, of course, go on to Nauvoo and other places where he would face similar experiences as well.
What a powerful way to describe that and make that parallel, Jeremiah, because his life is this series of like darkness and deliverance.
Right.
Darkness and deliverance. And like the Lord saying, I will come.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he says that to all of us. I mean, Joseph's journey in that terribly, right? He describes in the 1835, when he's telling someone about this experience, it's interesting how he says, in the attempt to pray, my tongue seemed to be swollen in my mouth, so I could not utter. I heard a noise behind me, like some person walking towards me. The noise of walking seemed to draw near. I sprung on my feet and looked around. I mean, so much fear, right? And not able to speak, and then overcome by darkness, we read in this 1838 account. And then it's like the light burst forth. And how many times in our lives, right, are there moments when it's like, I'm about to be swallowed up here? That's how he felt in Liberty, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
The jaws of hell, right, gaping.
Yeah. Gaping up. Yeah, and it's cold, it's dreadful, we can give ourselves into despair in that way.
Yes.
And you can see, so there's some consolation in this for all of us, because if the prophet Joseph Smith, who had gone through all of those things, could also
wondered.
Yeah,
right?
also wonder and be in that situation. Then when we face those challenges and we feel the same kind of despair, even a kind of anxiety or depression around it, that we can still have confidence in God, that He will deliver us.
So how did you do it? I mean, when you're being faced from family and loved ones with all this stuff trying to convince you that what you've done is wrong, how did you? I mean, I know some brilliant people that who are lifelong faithful members of the church that come across, literature or teachings that go against the church that
can be shaking.
Absolutely. So at such a young age, how were you able to, not only back then, but even now, just stay strong and true?
I wish it was an amazing answer to that question, but I will say,
maybe it's amazing in its simplicity.
It is amazing in its simplicity, and that is, do not let go of the things that you know. Right? When I prayed to know if this church was true, I received a witness of the Spirit. Then built upon that, I learned of the doctrine of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the fullness of the gospel, which I didn't have. And that included temples and the temple work and all the entire plan of salvation. When I found that out, I mean, I've often said to people, the doctrine that really did it for me was the doctrine of the temple and temple work. Because without it, the plan of salvation, it seems to me, has a gaping hole in it. And when I found that out, I knew those things were true, and I had received a testimony, born of the Spirit. And so when that happened, I held on with everything I had to those things. Now, I did the basic things too. So I prayed, I read my scriptures, I also went to church. But really holding on to those things that you know to be true. And then when other things come, you have to give some patience to it and let it sit. Let your understanding, your mind come around to it and understand there's probably another reason for this. There's probably another explanation for it. And I've seen that in the course of my membership in the church. Like as I've remained, faithful, that some of those questions that I had or some of those questions that were raised resolved themselves and, were understandable.
Since we're talking about this amazing event that was initiated in part by a scripture that was read. And I love how Joseph says about reading James 1:5. Verse 12, he says, "Never did any passage of scripture come with more power to the heart of a man than this did at this time to mine." Do you have a power scripture that is just really sunk deep into your heart, something that you go back to during various times of your life?
Well, I do have one, and it's related to a time in which I was called as the stake president. And I was fairly young at the time, and I was, I had served as a bishop, and I'd served in other capacities, but I was inexperienced, and I was young. And, I'm energetic, and I come up with ideas and do all those things, and sometimes that's not the person they're looking for. But in this case, it was, so I was called by then Elder Russell M. Nelson to be a stake president. And so talk about overwhelming.
Right.
And I can remember him saying, President Morgan, you've got 3 minutes to share your testimony during a stake conference. This is when I was called. And I'm thinking to myself, what will I say? Of course.
In front of Elder Nelson.
In front of Elder Nelson and Sister Nelson, and then all this huge audience of members. And I remember pacing, walking that morning, knowing that it was coming. And I was reflecting over and over again about what could I say? And then my mind was drawn to section 128 of the Doctrine and Covenants. 127 and 128, again, this understanding about the work of temples and
that you had been drawn to years
that I'd been drawn to.
before.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so my mind was drawn to that, and I read this verse, and I love it.
This is section 128.
This is 128, and it's verse 22. And we'll recognize it because it's often quoted.
And Joseph is in hiding at this time.
Yeah.
He can't even
He's
get
in the
out,
hunter
right?
home. He's in the hunter home in Nauvoo, and he's in hiding.
Chased right by the Missouri, right?
That's right.
And out of that
Even though I'm
place.
from Missouri, we're not chasing him. Back then they were.
Yeah.
He's in hiding. He's having all those difficulties. You could be discouraged, or he could have been discouraged easily. But I just love the optimism, and we see it in our living prophets and apostles today. You love to see the optimism that he shares in this. He begins in verse 22. He says, "Brethren," I think we could say brothers and sisters, "shall we not go on in so great a cause? Go forward and not backward. Courage, brethren and sisters, and on to the victory. Let your hearts rejoice and be exceedingly glad. Let the earth break forth into singing. Let the dead speak forth anthems of eternal praise to the King Emmanuel, who hath ordained before the world was that which would enable us to redeem them out of their prisons, for the prisoners shall go free." I love that. The optimism, and so that has been sort of one of my guiding, scriptures, if you will, throughout my life. When I face challenging times, I say to myself, "Shall we not go on in so great a cause as this?"
I would love to take advantage of having Jeremiah here, Jenet, and have him.
Me too.
I would love to get some of your thoughts and maybe experiences as the church has, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has newly acquired some really important sites and artifacts. What can you share with us about that experience?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of staggering to consider what has come to the church. And again, the Community of Christ maintained those properties and those artifacts and so forth for so long and did a wonderful job with that. But to consider the significance of not only the sites and so forth, but also the materials. I mean, the inspired translations that the prophet Joseph Smith did of the Bible were a part of that. And that's amazing to consider. Now, I think, not only the sites, but what doctrines they teach. So you take, for example, and you referenced it earlier, Jenet, and that is Kirtland Temple. In the Kirtland Temple, some of the great revelations. I mean, the Savior appeared to the prophet Joseph Smith, Elijah, Elias, Moses, all appeared, restoring those keys. And so to be able to tell that story
in the place,
right, is a powerful opportunity to, again, teach those that will visit about the importance of not only the restoration of the gospel, but also of the continuing revelation, the continuing keys and the authority and power that presents to all of us. So that's just one of them. And then you go from there to, for example, to Nauvoo, where the church now has stewardship for the Joseph Smith homestead, the Mansion House, the Nauvoo House, and several other properties.
The Red Brick Store.
The Red Brick Store.
Where the Relief Society was organized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's staggering to consider, and I think it's important for all of us not just to go to those sites and just experience the location, but especially to think about what happened there and what truths were revealed there. I mean, the Red Brick Store.
Yeah.
I mean, the temple ordinances were first provided there in that store in the upper room, and in addition to the organization of the Relief Society, one of the most influential women's organization in the history of the world. And right there, I think, and I would commend anyone to go read the minutes of the organizing meeting of the Relief Society. It's phenomenal. I mean, this is what Emma says. Emma says, we're going to do extraordinary things.
Yeah.
I just love it.
Yeah.
And so that's what some of those things mean, to be able to not only be in those locations, to be able to, to tell those experiences, but also to have people reflect upon that and how it affects their life today.
Oh, just thrilling to think about, right, what it means to be in those places and to have that story told. Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking, this building of restoration that begins with this grand vision, inexpressibly powerful, and to culminate in families being sealed together. So as they're administering the ordinances there he's teaching the 12 about the temple in the Red Brick Store. You have to organize the Relief Society. Why? Because it's fundamental to the full restoration, including, as he said, this is to prepare you for the temple. Yeah. I now turn the key in your behalf. And so you just see from the beginning this plan, starting with this first vision and the layer upon layer of restoration that is ultimately the great expression of God's love for us.
And if I could just add one thought to that. I mean, and the Relief Society came about because of an inquiry, because the sisters wanted to do something, right? It's in the same pattern that we see in the first vision.
How do we help, right?
Exactly. It wasn't Joseph went to them and said, organize yourself.
Yes.
They came and said, we would like to do these things. How can we help? And then Joseph, recognizing that as, the Lord's design, then, as you said, I'll turn the key for this.
So beautiful. It's such an honoring of our agency.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
In our inspired seeking for truth, and the Lord says, I am ready to pour out.
Yeah.
Jeremiah, as we're talking about these significant early events of the restoration, what can you share with us about the emphasis on studying the proclamation on the restoration and maybe some of the significance of that coming out at this time?
Yeah. To me, that was a, I don't want to say overstate it, but it was a dramatic moment for me, because the difference that the church brings is to this is that a living prophet and apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, going back to and not only reminding, but reiterating our beliefs in those fundamental doctrines. What was revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith in 1820 is as true today as it ever was in 1820. And we do not have to be afraid of it, walk away from it, be afraid to share it. I mean, it is unique. There's no question. How many religions or churches out there will say God and Jesus Christ appeared at the beginning of the church and the organization of the church and the restoration of the gospel? But we do not have to be afraid of it. It is true, and it is, as I said, true today as ever it was true in 1820. And I love that President Nelson read that, reaffirming our faith in those things and those fundamental truths that are true today.
Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I feel like we could just go on for hours talking. Jeremiah, you've been so great to join us and to share all of your experiences and knowledge with us. What a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
It's been great to be with you, Ben and Jenet.
And Jenet as well. Yes, it's always great to learn from you. And you've done such a wonderful job of really walking us through these verses and teaching us so much. So thanks for being here as well.
Thank you, Ben.
And for those watching at home, thank you for joining us for this discussion from Joseph Smith History 1, verses 1 through 26. In addition to weekly episodes, we offer clips, quotes, illustrations, and more available anytime for free at BYUtv.org or through any of our social media channels. Please join us next week as we study Doctrine and Covenants, Section 2. Thank you for watching.